Alina Carter had spent 7 quiet years moving through the polished glass corridors of Reed Industries like a steady heartbeat the company never acknowledged, but relied on completely. She was the woman whose presence kept entire departments from collapsing into chaos, the one who solved problems before they were spoken aloud, who filled silences with efficiency and made the impossible look routine. And yet, despite her competence, despite the fact that half the empire ran on her unseen labor, Alina lived a life defined by invisibility. She blended herself so fully into the corporate machinery that people often spoke around her rather than to her, as if she were a well-designed part of the building rather than a living human being with a pulse, a history, and dreams she had quietly folded away in the deepest corners of her mind. She arrived at the office each morning before the sun climbed over the skyline, moving through the empty lobby with the ease of someone who knew every shadow and echo by heart. She turned on lights no one noticed had been off, started coffee no one realized she brewed, and laid out briefs, notes, and schedules with the precision of a surgeon. Her suit was always the same quiet shade of professionalism, charcoal, navy, black, and her hair stayed in a tight bun that hid softness, length, and the wild waves she never allowed anyone to see. Alina had learned a long time ago that the more you showed, the easier it was for people to dismiss you. So she hid her style, her dreams, even her laughter, and it worked. People trusted her competence but never thought about the person inside the role. The one man whose attention mattered most, however, rarely seemed to see her at all. Jackson Reed, CEO, visionary, industry lion, moved through life with the confidence of a man who knew everything would bend before his will. At 37, he had already become the type of figure business schools studied. Brilliant, unapologetically demanding, and so married to his work that the idea of vulnerability looked foreign on him. His presence walked into rooms before he did, his decisions carried weight before he even voiced them, and his expectations stretched higher than the city skyline outside his office windows. Yet to Alina, despite the intimidation, despite the pressure he radiated, he was simply Mr. Reed, the man whose world she kept running with the tireless devotion of someone who understood the cost of being indispensable and invisible at the same time. Their dynamic was clockwork, mechanical, predictable, efficient. He would walk in with a clipped greeting, she would hand him the day's folder already adjusted for inevitable complications, and he would disappear into meetings while she built the scaffolding that held his day together. Theirs was not animosity. It wasn't affection either. It was habit, a pattern carved by time and necessity. He relied on her the way one relies on gravity, ever-present, unchanging, taken for granted. And Alina, in the quiet corners of her heart she rarely touched, wondered what it might feel like to be seen not as an asset, but as a person. Monday mornings always felt heavier, but this one arrived with an unusual charge in the air. Alina sensed it before she understood it. Her intuition had always been sharp, honed by years of anticipating Jackson's needs, moods, and the subtle shifts in company culture. Something was brewing, something different, and that suspicion was confirmed the moment she walked into the conference room later that morning, laptop balanced in her arms, posture straight as a ruler. The senior leadership team gathered with a buzz of restless energy. People whispered in corners, exchanged speculative glances, and checked their phones even more obsessively than usual. When Jackson finally entered, tall, composed, expression unreadable, the room straightened as if pulled by an invisible thread. He didn't need to demand attention, his presence commanded it effortlessly. He set his tablet on the table, glanced around, and then delivered the announcement that shifted the entire rhythm of the company. "Before we end today's meeting," he said, voice low but carrying through the room, "I want to discuss this year's leadership retreat." Alina's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Retreats were usually dreary affairs held in dim hotel conference rooms where stale coffee and forced team-building exercises were the highlight. But today, Jackson's tone carried something different, something almost human. "This year's retreat will be held at the Shores Resort," he continued, watching reactions ripple across the table. 3 days, oceanfront, a reward for exceeding quarterly goals. Attendance is mandatory for all leadership and support staff. The Shores Resort. The name alone painted an image of sand, sunlight, and a world far removed from the rigid metal and glass structure of the corporate tower. Alina felt a jolt of apprehension tighten her chest. The resort was famous for its relaxed environment, casual clothing, open-air lounges, pools, beaches. This wasn't her world. This wasn't the realm where she could hide behind suits and schedules and silence. This was a place where people unwound, laughed, breathed. and she wasn't sure she remembered how to do any of those things without feeling exposed. When the meeting adjourned, she slipped out quietly, hoping to escape before anyone initiated the kind of enthusiastic chatter she wasn't good at navigating. But Monica Chen, her closest friend and one of the few people who saw her as Alina rather than Carter, intercepted her with a grin that was far too wide for comfort. 3 days at a resort, Monica practically sang, linking her arm through Alina's. Do you realize this is the first time in 7 years the company has done something remotely fun? It's still a work event, Alina replied, staring straight ahead, hoping her unease didn't show. Work event? Monica scoffed. Alina, this is a sign. You're always buried in schedules and spreadsheets. Now you get a chance to actually exist outside your assistant role. You can't show up there looking like you're about to attend a board meeting. I wasn't planning anything else, Alina admitted quietly. Monica stopped walking and turned to her with the intensity of someone issuing a life-saving intervention. No, absolutely not. We are going shopping this weekend, and I am picking your outfits. You deserve to feel like a human being for once. Alina wanted to refuse. She wanted to cling to the armor that had protected her for so many years. But the truth settled heavily in her chest. She was tired of being invisible, tired of being predictable, tired of living a life so tightly controlled that she sometimes forgot who she had been before Reed Industries consumed her identity. So she agreed. She regretted it almost immediately when Monica dragged her into a boutique full of vibrant colors and soft fabrics Alina rarely allowed herself to touch. Dresses she would have never considered, shoes she never wore. And then, almost as a joke, Monica held up an ocean green swimsuit against her. Alina, Monica breathed, this is the one. No, Alina said instantly, shaking her head. No, absolutely not. Yes, Monica insisted, eyes shining with the kind of fierce honesty only real friends possessed. You hide your entire self behind those suits. You forget you're allowed to feel alive. This weekend isn't about impressing anyone. It's about letting yourself exist. The words hit deeper than expected. Exist, not function, not serve, exist. Alina looked at her reflection, her hair tied back, her posture stiff, her expression guarded. She had spent so long building herself into the perfect assistant that she had shrunk the rest of her identity into a tight, quiet space she rarely visited. Something in her softened. She bought the swimsuit. The days leading to the retreat passed in a haze of anticipation and dread. The office buzzed with excitement, people discussing plans, outfits, excursions. But Alina drifted through it like a ghost, wondering what would be expected of her outside the familiar rhythm of the workday. Jackson did not mention the retreat again, but she caught him watching her once from his office window, expression unreadable, just for a second before he returned to his computer. She dismissed it as coincidence. Friday arrived, bright and heavy with tension. As the buses lined up outside the building, employees gathered with luggage and chatter. Alina boarded quietly, taking a window seat toward the back, her laptop bag resting beside her like a shield. When the bus finally rolled toward the coastline, the city gradually faded into open sky, sunlight glinting off the horizon in a way that felt like a distant promise she didn't yet understand. The shore's resort was breathtaking, white sand stretching endless beneath a soft blue sky, palm trees rustling against a warm ocean breeze, and a hotel that looked like luxury carved into the earth. Alina checked into her room, a serene space with a balcony overlooking the ocean, and felt both awe and fear settle inside her. That evening, at the welcome reception, she blended into the shadows as usual, wearing a navy dress neat enough to pass for business casual. Laughter echoed around her, people loosened by freedom and ocean air, but Alina felt the weight of every unfamiliar emotion pressing against her ribs. Jackson stood at the far end of the pool, surrounded by department heads, drink in hand yet posture still commanding. He looked impossibly in his element, even here, where the boundary between professional and personal blurred under warm light. He didn't glance her way. He never did. But tomorrow, Monica reminded her gently, things would be different. Tomorrow was the beach day. Tomorrow she would step out of her armor for the first time in years. Tomorrow, whether she wanted it or not, someone, maybe everyone, would finally see Alina instead of Carter. And that thought kept her awake long after the waves whispered the world to sleep. The day the world finally saw her. The morning sun rose in a soft sweep over the shore's resort, casting a golden shimmer across the ocean as if the waves themselves were waking slowly, stretching into the day with effortless grace. But Alina Carter woke long before that sunlight reached her windows. She lay still beneath the crisp hotel sheets, staring at the ceiling with a tightness in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Not fear exactly, but something sharper, more revealing. Anticipation mixed with anxiety, the strange awareness that today would push her into a version of herself she had kept buried for so long she wasn't sure she knew how to call it forward anymore. She turned on her side, hearing the faint sounds of waves brushing the shore below her balcony, a rhythm that felt older than worry itself. For a moment she let herself breathe with that rhythm, closing her eyes and sinking into the realization that this unexpected trip, this forced pause, this detour outside her carefully controlled world, might be the first opportunity life had given her to remember who she really was before she molded herself into a shadow. When Monica messaged her beach at 8, no excuses, Alina almost replied with one. She almost typed out something practical, something about needing to check emails or prepare the schedule for Monday or update the minutes from yesterday's reception. But her fingers froze, because she realized the only thing those excuses ever did was protect her from change. And maybe she didn't want protection anymore. So she typed back a simple okay, got up slowly, and stood before the mirror. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Not because she looked different, but because she looked vulnerable, stripped of her structured suits, her severe bun, her quiet office persona. Her hair, when she released it from its tightly controlled knot, fell down her back in soft, natural waves she had not worn publicly in almost a decade. She touched her reflection gently, as if reacquainting herself with a forgotten friend. She took out the swimsuit, the ocean green one Monica had insisted on, and held it against her body for a long, silent moment. It felt symbolic somehow, an invitation to step into a life she had locked away, a life where she wasn't only an assistant but a woman with her own identity, her own presence, her own story. Putting it on felt like crossing a line she didn't know she had drawn around herself. She layered the white cover-up over it, tied it loosely around her waist, and slipped on the new sandals that felt foreign compared to her usual sensible heels. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to walk like she wasn't carrying the weight of an entire corporation on her shoulders. By the time she stepped out of her suite and made her way down the path toward the beach, the resort had already begun to hum with life. Early conversations drifted around her, lighthearted laughter floated through the air, and the scent of sunscreen and ocean breeze wrapped around her like a warm welcome. Employees she recognized only in the context of boardrooms and conference calls now appeared human, relaxed, dressed in shorts and sundresses, chatting without the rigid barriers of professionalism. It was almost disorienting to see them this way, stripped of their office personas. She wondered if she looked equally unfamiliar to them. Monica spotted her from a distance and waved wildly, her bright floral cover-up fluttering. "Alina, over here!" Alina walked toward her, heart hammering in her chest, trying to hide the trembling in her hands. Monica eyed her from head to toe before her expression softened into something close to pride. "You look stunning," she whispered, "and terrified." Alina exhaled, nodding. "I'm not used to being this." "Being what?" Monica pressed gently. "Visible," Alina whispered, her voice barely carrying above the sound of the waves. A moment passed between them, quiet, intimate, understanding, before Monica squeezed her hand. "Today is not about anyone's gaze. Today is about you giving yourself permission to breathe." They settled into lounge chairs by the shoreline, but Alina barely sat before Monica nudged her. "Come on," she said. "We're going to the water. Just walk. No overthinking. Just be." And before Alina could object, Monica pulled her toward the shoreline, where the cool waves lapped at their feet. The shock of the water made Alina gasp and laugh, an unguarded, spontaneous laugh she hadn't heard from herself in years. Monica's smile widened. "There she is," she murmured. And then something happened that would alter the course of the entire weekend. Because while Alina and Monica stood in the shallow waves, letting the water soak their feet and the breeze lift their hair, someone else arrived on the beach. Someone Alina had hoped, prayed, and almost expected not to see there. Jackson Reed. He walked along the shoreline with the natural authority he carried everywhere, but here, with the sun softening his sharp edges and the wind loosening his usual rigidity, he looked more human than Alina had ever seen him. He wore dark swim shorts and a simple charcoal t-shirt, sunglasses shielding his eyes. Yet even in this relaxed environment, his presence commanded attention. People glanced his way reflexively, stepping aside without realizing it, their conversations momentarily halting. Alina froze. Monica followed her gaze and her eyebrows lifted slowly. "Well," she whispered, "that's unexpected. He actually came to the beach." "I thought he'd be working," Alina murmured, her breath catching in her throat. It felt irrational to react so strongly. He was just a person, just her boss. But something about him seeing her like this, outside the armor of her professional persona, made her feel exposed in a way she couldn't fully articulate. What Alina didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that in that exact same moment Jackson Reed had paused mid-step, because something caught his attention. Something he wasn't prepared for, something that made him stop, straighten, and look again. He saw her, not Carter, not the efficient, invisible assistant who lived in the background of his long days. He saw Alina, her hair loose and illuminated by sunlight, her posture relaxed for the first time since he had known her, her laughter soft, unguarded, real, carried on the ocean breeze, her cover-up fluttering gently around her in the wind. There was nothing inappropriate in his reaction, nothing objectifying or unprofessional. What struck him wasn't appearance, it was the unfamiliarity. For 7 years, he had seen only her competence. He had never noticed her humanity. And now, confronted with the full presence of the person behind the role, he felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, as if he were seeing a story he didn't realize he had been part of all along. He blinked, staring longer than he should have, his expression unreadable behind the dark lenses. He didn't even realize he had slowed his steps until he caught himself and forced his gaze away. But something in him had already shifted, a question forming quietly beneath his composed exterior. Who is she, really? And how had he never noticed before? Alina, unaware of the intensity with which she had momentarily captured his attention, turned back to Monica, cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and adrenaline. "Let's just sit," she whispered. "I don't want anyone staring." "Alina," Monica said softly, "they're not staring because something is wrong. They're staring because you finally stepped out of the shadows." They returned to their lounge chairs, settling with towels and sunscreen and the pretense of relaxation. But Alina's mind felt restless, drifting back to the moment their eyes had almost, but not quite, met. She felt her pulse racing in a way that unsettled her. She tried to focus on the beach, the waves, the warmth, but somewhere behind her she sensed a presence, familiar, steady, commanding, lingering. In reality, Jackson had taken a seat several rows behind them, shaded under a palm tree, his tablet in hand. But his attention drifted, again and again, toward the quiet woman he had somehow overlooked for almost a decade. He wasn't staring out of inappropriate interest. It was something far more human and disorienting. Curiosity, regret, the sharp realization that he had never once tried to understand the life of the woman who kept his world running so flawlessly. At one point, he saw Monica laugh and toss water toward Alina, who responded with a startled gasp and a burst of genuine laughter that brightened her entire face. Jackson felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, a strange sense of loss that he had been blind to this Alina, this softness, this joy. Not because he wanted her personally, but because he suddenly recognized how deeply he had underestimated her humanity. He closed his tablet, unable to focus. She has a life, he thought, surprised by the simplicity of the revelation. She has a story. And the fact that he had worked beside her for 7 years without knowing anything about that story unsettled him more than any business setback had in years. The beach day lasted hours, full of light and warmth and moments Alina would tuck carefully into her memories. She didn't notice that more colleagues looked at her than before, not in judgment, but in surprise, as if seeing someone they had never truly paid attention to. She didn't notice the way people softened when talking to her, how they responded to her presence with more openness than the rigid office environment ever allowed. She didn't notice Jackson leaving early, deep in thought, replaying the morning in his mind with an expression that no employee had ever witnessed on him. But she felt something, a shift, a quiet awakening inside her, fragile but powerful. For the first time in years, she felt real. Visible, seen not by others but by herself. That evening, as she stood alone on her balcony watching the sunset paint the sea in gold and crimson, Alina realized something important. The version of herself she kept locked away wasn't gone. She had simply forgotten how to open the door. And today, for the first time in a long time, the door creaked open. Just a little, just enough. But she had no idea that the man whose world she helped build was standing on his own balcony 2 floors above hers, staring at the same ocean, wrestling with a realization that would quietly reshape the days to come. He had taken her for granted, and he didn't know how to undo 7 years of blindness. the shift no one saw coming. The next morning unfolded with a soft, almost unreal calm that blanketed the shore's resort in a golden glow, as if the sun itself had decided to move gently for the sake of those waking beneath its warmth. Elena woke later than usual, not from exhaustion, but from something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Rest. Real rest. The kind that softened the edges of her thoughts and made her body feel weightless beneath the sheets. She lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the ocean just beyond her balcony, the rhythmic hush of waves brushing the shore in a soothing embrace. For the first time, she didn't feel compelled to jump up and check her emails or prepare Jackson's schedule or rehearse the day's responsibilities in her head. She let herself breathe, slow and deep, allowing the morning to meet her instead of running toward it. Her mind drifted back to the beach day, the unfamiliar laughter that had burst from her chest, the sunlight on her skin, the way colleagues looked at her with something close to surprise and gentleness. But the moment that lingered in the deepest part of her memory was the unexpected one, the way Jackson had paused when he saw her. She tried to convince herself it meant nothing, that she had imagined it, that he was simply reacting to seeing his assistant outside the rigid boundaries of the office. Yet the image replayed itself quietly, the way he froze, however briefly, and the slight shift in his posture that suggested he was seeing someone he couldn't quite categorize. She tried to dismiss the memory, but each time she pushed it away, another part of her tugged it back, whispering that something had changed, not between them necessarily, but within her. Elena finally rose, brushing her fingers through her hair as she stepped onto the balcony. The air was cool, the sky streaked with pastels, the water shimmering softly in the distance. She stood there for several minutes before noticing movement in her peripheral vision. 2 floors above, a figure stepped onto a separate balcony, the posture unmistakably familiar. Jackson. Even from this distance, he carried the same controlled stillness, the same quiet command, the same unreadable presence. He was looking at the ocean, not at her, unaware she was there. But she couldn't help wondering why he looked more contemplative than usual, why he stood there longer than he typically allowed himself to be idle, why he looked like a man who had discovered a question he didn't yet know how to ask. She stepped back into her room quietly, not wanting him to look down and see her watching. She wasn't ready for that. By the time she made her way downstairs to the breakfast area, the atmosphere had transformed into the kind of lively chaos only a relaxed corporate retreat could produce. Executives hovered around coffee stations, interns waved cheerfully at one another, and employees dressed in casual clothes rather than corporate armor chatted with a warmth that rarely crossed the threshold of the office. The resort's open-air dining room was filled with the aroma of pastries, fresh fruit, and coffee, and the soft crash of ocean waves blended into the background like a soundtrack meant to calm even the most anxious mind. Monica spotted her almost immediately, waving from a table near the railing. "Elena, over here!" Elena moved toward her, unaware that more than a few employees glanced her way, not out of judgment, not out of curiosity, but out of familiarity. The beach day had shifted something subtle. People now saw her as a person, not just a desk in front of Jackson's office. "You slept in," Monica teased as Elena sat down. "That's a historic moment." "I must have needed it," Elena answered softly, pouring herself a cup of tea. "You did," Monica said with certainty. "You've been carrying the company on your shoulders for years. One morning of rest won't kill the world." Elena smiled faintly, but she didn't reply, because a different presence had begun to approach the dining area, and even without looking, she felt it. Jackson Reed. She knew his stride by sound alone, the confident, measured rhythm, neither rushed nor lazy, as if the entire world moved at his pace. She felt the air shift, the conversation soften, and the usual ripple of awareness that followed him wherever he went. She didn't turn. She didn't want to, but Monica's eyebrows lifted just enough to confirm her suspicion. He was nearby. Jackson greeted a few department heads politely, then walked toward the buffet area, selecting fruit and coffee with a precision that mirrored how he approached his work. Yet even as he moved with his usual composure, his attention drifted, subtly, quietly, toward Elena. It wasn't inappropriate, it wasn't intense. It was curious, observational, as if he was trying to reconcile 2 versions of a person he thought he knew but realized he didn't. He approached their table. Not directly, not intentionally, just close enough to retrieve utensils from the station a few steps away. Elena felt her heartbeat picking up, but she kept her eyes on her tea, willing herself not to react. "Good morning," Jackson said, his voice lower than usual, though steady. Monica smiled warmly. "Morning, Mr. Reed. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yes," he replied, but his gaze flickered to Alina briefly, fleetingly, yet unmistakably. "Carter." It was the first time he said her name with even a hint of hesitation. The first time he seemed unsure of the label he'd used for so many years. "Good morning, sir," Alina managed, her voice even despite the subtle tension tightening her spine. He nodded, then moved toward another table, but the impression he left behind was something Alina couldn't categorize. It wasn't attention. It wasn't recognition. It was awareness, like a door had opened somewhere in his mind and he was tentatively stepping through it. When he sat down across the dining area, his position gave him a clear view of Alina, not deliberately, not intrusively, but enough that he could observe without looking like he was observing. And every so often his gaze drifted, studying her in a way she had never experienced from him before, not as an assistant, not as an extension of the office, but as a person existing freely in a world beyond his control. "What is happening?" Alina whispered to Monica, who leaned in conspiratorially. "He's seeing you," Monica said simply. "That doesn't make sense. Why now?" "Because you're finally allowing the world to see you," Monica replied softly. "And he's part of that world." The morning unfolded with a series of team activities: beach volleyball, paddle boarding, guided meditation. And while Alina participated lightly, she was careful to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Yet she couldn't avoid the subtle shift in the way people interacted with her. A finance manager she barely knew invited her to join a group game. A senior strategist complimented her earlier laughter, saying it brightened the morning. Even the quiet IT lead, who rarely spoke to anyone outside his team, approached her to ask about a restaurant recommendation someone had mentioned she tried last year. It wasn't vanity, it was visibility. And visibility, she realized, wasn't as terrifying as she had believed. Meanwhile, Jackson moved through the group with his usual composure, but his thoughts were far from usual. He found himself distracted, his leadership facade cracking just enough for him to notice things he never took time to see. How people gravitated toward Alina in small but meaningful ways. How her presence softened interactions. How her quiet kindness seemed to influence the emotional temperature of any group she was part of. At one point, during a team exercise near the water, he caught Alina concentrating on something intensely. Her brow furrowed, her posture slightly leaning forward, her hair swaying in the breeze. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't infatuation. It was realization. A slow, dawning recognition that the woman he relied on so heavily in the office was far more complex, far more human, far more whole than he had ever allowed himself to see. Around midday, the group scattered for free time. Alina slipped away from the crowd, walking toward the quieter part of the beach where the shoreline stretched unbroken and untouched. She wanted silence, space, a moment to gather her thoughts. She took off her sandals and stepped into the cool sand, feeling the grains cling to her feet as she walked toward the water. Each step felt like shedding a layer of the professionalism she wore too tightly. She stood with her toes in the surf, gazing at the horizon, unaware that someone else had followed at a considerate distance, someone who hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Jackson stopped several yards behind her, watching her carefully, his expression unreadable. He wasn't invading her solitude. He wasn't seeking conversation. He simply felt drawn by a rare moment of curiosity that had pushed past years of habit. He studied her silhouette against the ocean, the gentle way she stood, the quiet strength in her posture. And he felt something foreign, an unfamiliar blend of guilt and admiration. 7 years beside her. 7 years of never asking who she was when she left the office. 7 years of assuming she existed only within the boundaries of his schedule. He didn't know whether he should approach or retreat. But Alina solved the dilemma for him. She turned. Their eyes met across the quiet stretch of sand, a soft, steady gaze that held no accusation, no expectation, only acknowledgement. And for the first time since she had known him, Jackson looked human, not in control, not composed, not impenetrable. Human. He took a slow breath, and something in him wavered ever so slightly. "Carter," he said softly, almost uncertain, an uncertainty she had never heard from him. "Mr. Reed," she replied, equally steady, equally unsure. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was new. It was the beginning of a shift neither of them could articulate yet. A shift that would change the tone of the entire retreat. A shift that, in quiet, Unspoken ways had already begun. The moment that broke the distance. The afternoon sun lay thick and warm across the resort, turning the ocean into a shimmering expanse of liquid silver as Alina walked slowly along the shoreline with her thoughts spinning in circles she couldn't escape. Her conversation, or rather, the brief exchange she had with Jackson earlier kept replaying in fragments, not because of what was said, but because of the silence that had wrapped around it. She had seen that man command boardrooms, negotiate multi-million-dollar deals, and dismiss entire proposals with the flick of an indifferent glance. But today, on that quiet stretch of sand, he looked unprepared, uncertain. And it wasn't the weakness of uncertainty, but the humanity of it. For the first time in 7 years, she saw a man instead of a role, and that realization unsettled her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She returned to her room to shower and change before the evening's dinner gathering. The resort had organized a sunset terrace event, semi-casual but polished, with soft music, lanterns, and an ocean breeze threading through everything like a graceful guest. Alina stood before her closet, fingers lingering over the dresses Monica had convinced her to pack. Each one felt foreign yet strangely inviting. She wasn't the woman who wore bright colors or flowing fabrics, yet a quiet voice inside her whispered that it wouldn't hurt to try. So she chose a soft dove-blue dress, modest yet elegant, with a delicate neckline and a gentle drape that moved with her like water. She brushed out her hair, letting it fall freely across her shoulders, and for the first time she added a touch more color to her makeup. Nothing bold, just enough to remind herself that she was allowed to exist outside invisibility. When she walked into the terrace area later, the glow of lanterns reflected off the ocean in blurred, dancing lights, and the murmured conversations of colleagues floated around her like low music. People noticed her arrival, their faces shifting from casual interest to subtle surprise. She had always blended into the room, now she entered it, and that alone changed the way people saw her. Monica, standing near the bar with a drink in hand, nearly choked when she saw her. "Alina, Carter, my God!" Alina laughed softly, shaking her head. "Is that good or bad?" "It's miraculous," Monica whispered. "You look like you stepped out of a dream you forgot belonged to you." Alina flushed at the comment, glancing away, only to find herself locking eyes with someone across the room. Jackson. He stood near a group of executives, listening to something one of them was saying, but his attention wasn't on the conversation. It was on her, not a stare, not an appraisal, just awareness. A quiet pause in his mind as he saw her step into the evening not as his assistant, not as a background figure, but as a woman with her own presence, her own grace, her own world. He excused himself from the group without breaking their eye contact for a moment longer than necessary, then made his way through the crowd with the steady composure that defined him. Alina felt her pulse thrum beneath her skin, unsure if she should turn away or hold her ground. She chose to hold it, not out of defiance, but out of something new growing inside her, self-acceptance. When he reached her, there was a subtle shift in the air, one she sensed but couldn't explain. Jackson stood before her, not as her boss, not as the CEO everyone tiptoed around, but as a man trying to understand the version of someone he had overlooked for too long. "You look different," he said, searching for the right word, the right tone, the right distance between them. Alina smiled, her voice calm and steady. "Maybe I'm just more myself here." He nodded slowly, absorbing her words, his expression softening in a way she rarely witnessed. "I suppose I haven't given myself the chance to see that before." She blinked, surprised by the humility in his tone. Jackson Reed was many things, brilliant, driven, relentless, but humble was rarely one of them. Yet here he was, acknowledging his own blindness not with defensiveness, but with a quiet sincerity that left her momentarily speechless. The evening unfolded in subtle shifts like that, moments that rewrote years of unspoken boundaries. Jackson didn't hover near her, nor did he retreat entirely. Instead, he drifted just close enough to make her aware of his presence in a way she had never experienced. He listened with genuine interest when she spoke with colleagues, almost as if hearing her voice outside the office was a novelty he wasn't prepared for. He watched her laugh, her shoulders no longer held tight with professionalism, and each time something in him eased. He asked her questions, not about work, not about schedules, but about her. What she enjoyed, what she did on weekends, how she found her way into administrative work. They were simple questions, but they felt profound because they came from a man who had never asked her anything personal in 7 long years. At one point, as a soft breeze swept through the terrace, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine, Alina found herself standing alone at the railing, looking out at the horizon where the sun melted into the sea in a spectacular wash of gold and crimson. She wrapped her arms loosely around herself, not out of cold but out of the quiet intimacy of the moment. The world felt far away, softened by distance, drawn into silence by the beauty of the view. She didn't realize someone had approached until she heard a familiar voice, quiet but steady. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Jackson asked from beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She turned slightly, caught off guard. "Leaving Reed Industries." "Leaving this version of your life," he clarified. His tone wasn't intrusive, it was reflective, weighted with a question he might have been asking himself too. Alina hesitated, her eyes returning to the water. "Sometimes," she admitted, "not because I dislike my job, but because I wonder who I would be without it." "That's a question I've been avoiding for years," Jackson murmured, his hands resting lightly on the railing. Something in his voice, something raw and unguarded, made her look at him fully. His expression was calmer than she had ever seen it, stripped of his usual armor. He didn't look like the CEO who made brutal decisions without blinking. He looked like a man privately wrestling with the cost of the life he had built. "I thought success would mean something different," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But lately I've been wondering if I missed things along the way, important things." Her heart tightened. He wasn't talking about the company. He was talking about life. About himself. About all the years he buried under ambition. She didn't say anything, not out of fear, but because some truths didn't require immediate responses. Some truths simply needed witnesses. After a long pause, he turned to her. His gaze was steady but softer than she had ever known it. "You've changed this weekend," he said. "Or maybe I'm just seeing you for the first time." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "Maybe it's both." A stillness settled between them, not an awkward one, not a tense one, but a moment carved gently out of time. The kind that happens rarely in life, when two people who have known each other for years suddenly meet for the first time. Before either of them could say more, a cluster of colleagues called Jackson over for a toast. He hesitated, just slightly, before nodding to Alina and stepping away, but not before giving her one last glance that held layers of silent meaning neither of them dared to unfold yet. As the evening wound down, Alina returned to her room with a heart that felt too full, too shaken, too awakened for sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor, letting the weight of the night settle inside her. Something had shifted irrevocably, not in romance, not in inappropriate tension, but in the recognition of mutual humanity. For 7 years, she had been invisible to him. Tonight he saw her, truly saw her, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the years of silence and self-containment, a quiet truth unfurled like the beginning of a long-buried dream. She wasn't afraid of being seen anymore, but she was suddenly afraid of what it meant now that she was. The confession he never meant to make. The final morning of the retreat rose with a brightness that seemed almost symbolic, as if the world was gently insisting on clarity after days of quiet transformation. Alina woke before dawn despite having barely slept, her mind crowded with thoughts she hadn't yet found the courage to unpack. She sat on the edge of her bed, knees drawn slightly inward, staring at the thin slit of early sunlight creeping across the carpet as if it were marking a boundary she didn't know how to cross. She felt different, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. The retreat had peeled back layers she didn't know she was still wearing. More alarming, it had peeled something back from Jackson too, revealing pieces of a man she had never allowed herself to imagine outside the strict professional walls they lived behind. She rose quietly, tying her hair into a loose braid rather than her usual polished bun, and stepped out onto the balcony. The ocean stretched out before her, calm, vast, endless. She wrapped her arms around herself as the wind carried the scent of salt and early morning silences. She didn't expect anyone else to be awake at this hour, certainly not Jackson, the man who thrived on schedule, predictability, and routine. Yet just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, she noticed movement 2 floors up. He stepped outside, shoulders tense at first, then slowly relaxing as he took in the sight of the ocean. His presence felt familiar and foreign all at once. He didn't look down, she didn't call out, but something in the quiet parallel of their solitude made the world feel strangely intimate. She left her room soon after, determined to avoid the tangled emotions that followed her every step. The resort was nearly empty at this hour. She wandered down to the beach barefoot, letting the cool sand cling between her toes, the waves brushing gently at her ankles. She walked until the resort buildings felt distant enough to fade, until she could hear only the ocean and her thoughts. But Jackson found her anyway, not because he was seeking her, at least not consciously, but because he, too, had wandered down to the shoreline in search of something he couldn't articulate. His thoughts were a knot he hadn't untangled since the first moment he saw her truly, not as his assistant, but as a human being with depth and presence. And perhaps, for the first time in years, he wasn't running from the discomfort of realization. He saw her in the distance, a soft silhouette framed against the endless stretch of sea, her braid falling over her shoulder, her posture relaxed but contemplative. He hesitated, not because approaching her felt inappropriate, but because approaching her felt unfamiliar. Jackson Reed was a man who mastered every environment he stepped into: boardrooms, negotiations, crises, but this wasn't one of those arenas. This wasn't business. This wasn't strategy. This was human, quiet, unpredictable. Still, something in him moved forward. Alina sensed him before she heard him, the shift in air, the gentle crunch of sand beneath another pair of footsteps. She didn't turn immediately. She didn't need to. The only person who carried that blend of confidence and quiet indecision was him. "Didn't expect anyone else to be up," she said softly, still facing the ocean. "I could say the same to you," Jackson replied, his voice low, the morning breeze carrying it like a shared secret. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. The early sunlight softened his features, made him look less like the untouchable CEO everyone feared, and more like a man quietly confronting the cost of years spent building an empire. They stood only a few feet apart, the space between them filled with unspoken truths neither knew how to name. "You look different this morning," he said, his expression thoughtful. "Different how?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "Less guarded," he admitted, "more yourself." Alina glanced away, unsure how to respond. "Maybe it's the ocean." "Or maybe," he said gently, "it's because you finally stopped hiding behind who you think you're supposed to be." She felt a ripple pass through her, not of fear, but of recognition, because he wasn't wrong. She had spent years molding herself into the perfect professional shadow, erasing everything personal about her so she wouldn't distract from the role she played. And for the first time, someone had noticed the cost of that erasure. "Why did you come down here?" she asked after a moment. "I'm not sure," he answered honestly. "I just needed space to think." "About work," she offered, knowing that was his usual retreat. He shook his head, surprising her. "No, about everything else." She didn't press him, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. He stepped a little closer, the morning light catching the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. She nodded. "Why do you work the way you do?" he asked. "Why do you give so much of yourself? Why do you pour so much of your life into the company, into my schedule, into everything?" She blinked, taken aback. No one had ever asked her that, not colleagues, not managers, not even friends besides Monica. "Because that's my job," she said softly. "That's the easy answer," he replied. "I want the real one." She hesitated, struggling to find the words. "I guess I wanted to be someone others could rely on, someone who brought order to things, someone who mattered." "You mattered," he said almost too quickly. "You always have. I should have said that sooner." His voice cracked just slightly, and Alina felt a tightening in her chest that bordered on pain. "Have you ever wondered why I never moved on?" she asked quietly. "Why I never pursued a different job or a higher role?" He studied her, searching her face for meaning. "Because I was afraid that without this role, the world wouldn't see me at all," she whispered. "I thought if I kept everything perfect, everything smooth, everything organized, maybe that would be enough. Maybe I'd be enough." Jackson's expression shifted, something close to shock, regret, and realization blending together. "Alina," he began, using her name for the first time with genuine emotion, "you've always been enough, more than enough. I just never saw you clearly because I was too buried in my own world to look beyond it." She swallowed, the gentle crash of waves filling the silence between them. "That's not your fault," she murmured, though part of her wasn't sure she believed it. "It is," he insisted quietly. "I built a world where you had to disappear to survive, and you did. You became exactly what the company needed, exactly what I needed, but what about what you needed?" Alina felt her throat tighten. Not because of the words themselves, but because this man, this powerful, disciplined, often unreachable man, was admitting something she never expected him to see, the human cost behind her professionalism. "People don't usually ask me that," she whispered. "Then they've been blind," he said, his voice steady, "including me." She turned back toward the ocean, needing a moment to steady her heartbeat. He stood beside her in silence, not pushing, not demanding, simply waiting. And something about that patience, that rare softness, shook her in ways she couldn't articulate. After several moments, he finally spoke again, his voice lower, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "Do you know the moment I realized I've been missing something important?" he asked. She looked at him, her eyes questioning. "Yesterday," he admitted, staring at the waves as if searching for courage within them. "When you were laughing in the water, I didn't recognize you at first, not because you looked different, but because you looked free. And I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen you, any version of you, without stress in your eyes." She felt heat rise behind her eyes. Not tears, not yet, but something close. "I didn't know that mattered to you," she said softly. "It does," he said simply, "more than I expected." A quiet wind passed between them, swirling grains of sand at their feet. He wasn't confessing affection. He wasn't crossing boundaries. He wasn't speaking like a man with romantic intentions. He was speaking like someone who finally realized he had overlooked a human being who deserved far more than invisibility. Someone he now cared about, not romantically but genuinely. Someone he respected more deeply than he had words for. "I don't know what this means," he admitted, breaking the silence. "But I know I don't want to go back to seeing you only through the lens of work." Elena felt her breath catch. "Neither do I," she whispered. They stood together for a long time, watching the tide roll in, letting the morning stretch wide around them as if the world were holding its breath. They didn't touch. They didn't move. They didn't step past the unspoken boundary between them. But something undeniable shifted, soft, quiet, profound. A connection formed not by romance, not by desire, but by truth. A truth they could no longer ignore. When the walls finally cracked, final hours of the retreat carried a strange mixture of anticipation and melancholy, like the quiet ache that follows a profound moment you are not ready to let go of. Elena felt it the moment she stepped out of her room, suitcase rolling softly behind her. The resort grounds glowed with warm morning light, guests and colleagues moving about with slower, gentler energy, as if everyone subconsciously understood they were leaving not just a place, but a moment suspended outside the demands of real life. She walked with steady, measured steps, but inside she felt unsteady, as though the retreat had opened a part of her heart she didn't know was locked. She saw Monica first, sitting near the fountain, sipping her orange juice and pretending not to be watching the entrance for her. When she caught sight of Elena, she waved her over with dramatic enthusiasm. "Finally!" Monica exclaimed, her voice bright yet tinged with something she tried hard to hide. "I was starting to think you'd try to escape by digging a tunnel under the resort." Elena laughed softly, settling into the chair across from her. "I considered it," she replied, though her voice held a depth Monica immediately noticed. "You okay?" Monica asked gently, her tone shifting from playful to concerned. Elena hesitated for a long moment before answering. "I think something happened this weekend," she said quietly. "Not something big, but something important." Monica leaned forward. "With yourself or with him?" Elena looked down, her fingers gently tracing the soft fabric of her dress. "Both." Before Monica could respond, a shadow moved across them, a familiar presence that made the air shift. Jackson approached, suitcase in hand, expression composed, but carrying an undercurrent of something she couldn't name. He greeted a few colleagues with soft nods, but his gaze drifted toward Elena with a subtle pull he didn't try to hide. It wasn't a stare, not an inappropriate gaze, it was recognition. A recognition he had never given her before the retreat. "Elena," he said as he reached them, her name warm on his voice in a way that made something inside her tight. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Reed." "Jackson," he corrected gently, his tone low enough that only she could hear it. "At least for today." Her breath caught the ground beneath her, feeling suddenly uncertain, yet grounded at the same time. "Good morning, Jackson," she said quietly, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile before composing himself. They boarded the buses soon after, the atmosphere tinged with the post-retreat quietness that settles when people know they're returning to routines that don't fit as loosely as the beach's freedom. Elena took a seat near the window, her suitcase tucked beside her, heart unusually restless. She expected Monica to sit beside her, but when she turned to look, she saw Monica smirking and pointing toward the empty seat next to her. No, absolutely not. But before she could protest internally, before she could gather her thoughts, someone stepped onto the bus with slow, steady strides, the kind of strides belonging to someone who didn't think twice about the weight of his presence. Jackson. He scanned the rows, hesitating for the smallest fraction of a second when his eyes reached her seat. Then he walked forward, stopping beside her. "This seat taken?" he asked, voice smooth but carrying a hint of vulnerability. Her chest tightened. "No, you can sit." He nodded softly and lowered himself into the seat, his posture controlled, yet there was a subtle tension in his shoulders, as if he wasn't used to being this close to someone he wasn't ordering or directing. The bus pulled away from the resort, rolling through winding coastal roads as the ocean disappeared behind them. The hum of soft conversation floated around them, but neither of them spoke immediately. They simply sat in shared silence, not uncomfortable but surprisingly intimate in its stillness. After several minutes, Jackson spoke, his voice quiet, careful. "I've been thinking," he said, watching the passing landscape with an intensity that revealed more than his words initially did. "About work?" she asked gently. "No," he replied, "about you." Alina's breath stilled. She wasn't sure if he heard it. He continued before she could react. "I realized this weekend that I've been moving through my life with blinders on. I've been surrounded by people I never really saw. But you," he paused, searching for the right words. "You've been right beside me for 7 years, and somehow I never noticed how much of yourself you silenced to fit into the world I built." She swallowed thickly, the truth of his words touching a part of her she rarely shared with anyone. "I didn't silence myself because of you," she said softly. "I silenced myself because I thought that was the only way to be taken seriously, to be valued." He turned to her then, his gaze steady, almost apologetic. "If that's true, then it breaks me more than I expected." Her eyes widened slightly. Jackson Reed didn't speak like that, not in the office, not anywhere. His walls were legendary, yet here he was, cracking them open piece by fragile piece. "I didn't come down to the beach this morning to think about work," he continued. "I came down there because seeing you yesterday, seeing you laugh, seeing you relaxed, seeing you as yourself, it made me realize how little I've allowed emotion into my own life, and how much quieter the world feels when I don't." She felt her heart twist at the sincerity in his voice. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she whispered before she could stop herself. His expression softened, the edges of his confidence blurring. "I know," he said, "but I've lived so long thinking vulnerability was weakness that I forgot how to be human outside the office." The bus continued down the highway, rays of sunlight flickering across their faces through the windows. Their silence now felt charged, with understanding, with newness, with a fragile recognition neither fully knew how to hold. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice even softer than before. "Elena, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "If you hadn't taken that job 7 years ago, if you had followed the version of yourself before all this, before the suits and the long hours and the invisibility, what do you think your life would look like today?" She inhaled slowly, her eyes drifting toward the horizon outside the window. "I think I would have become someone less afraid," she said honestly. "Someone who didn't hide, someone who didn't measure her worth by how organized someone else's life was." He listened intently, each word carving itself quietly into his mind. "And what about now?" he asked. She turned to him, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I don't know yet, but this weekend showed me something I forgot. My life doesn't have to be built around other people's expectations." Jackson's expression shifted with something deep, something like regret mixed with admiration. "I'm glad you remembered that," he murmured. "You deserve a life that isn't defined by invisibility." Her heart thudded in her chest. "And what about you?" she asked quietly. "What do you want your life to be?" He stared ahead for a long moment, jaw tightening as if grappling with a truth he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "I want," he began slowly, "I want to stop feeling like success is the only language I'm allowed to speak. I want something more balanced, more real, and I don't know how to get there yet." Elena nodded, her voice gentle. "Maybe the first step is learning to see people, not just their roles." He looked at her again, his gaze steady and quiet. "Then I suppose you've already helped me take the first step." A thick silence settled between them, one heavy with meaning yet careful in its boundaries. They didn't reach for each other. They didn't touch. They didn't cross the lines of professionalism that defined their world, but something emotional, something transformative had undeniably shifted. He was no longer the unreachable CEO. She was no longer the invisible assistant. They were two human beings sitting side by side, sharing truths they had never shared with anyone else. When the bus finally neared the city, the skyline emerging in the distance like a reminder of the lives waiting for them, Jackson spoke once more, softly but with conviction. "Elena," he said, her name holding warmth now, "when we return to the office tomorrow, I don't want things to go back to the way they were." Neither did she, but the truth lingered heavily in the air. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. The day everything quietly changed. Monday morning arrived with the deceptive calm of any other workday, the city breathing its usual rhythm of traffic, routine, and the faint hum of ambition threading through every street. But for Elena, stepping out of her apartment that morning felt nothing like routine. The retreat still lived inside her, soft, unsettling, transformative, like an echo she couldn't silence even if she tried. She walked toward Reed Industries with steady steps, but each one carried a weight she didn't know how to place. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but she felt exposed in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. She had changed, and she didn't know how to hide that anymore. When she entered the towering glass building, she expected the usual. Her badge beeped at the security gate, the elevator dinged on the 48th floor, the familiar hallway stretched before her. But something was different. People looked at her, not in confusion, not in surprise, but with a soft recognition she had never received before. Several nodded hello. A few smiled. One or two even stopped to ask about her weekend. These were people who never looked up from their screens long enough to notice she existed. Visibility, it wasn't terrifying anymore. She reached her desk, the same neatly organized space outside Jackson's office door, and her breath stilled. There, placed gently on her keyboard, was a steaming cup of coffee, not the generic office kind, not the usual blend she made every morning at 6:45 for him. It was her coffee, the exact order Monica teased her about, the order no one in the office knew she liked. She stared at the cup for a long, silent moment before lifting it. A small, sticky note was attached to the side. "Thought you might appreciate starting the week slowly, Jay." Her fingers trembled slightly, not because the gesture was romantic, because it was human. It was acknowledgement. It was a quiet apology wrapped in warmth. Before she could fully process the note, his voice drifted from behind her, calm, low, familiar, but different. "Good morning, Elena." She turned. There he stood, Jackson Reed, in a navy suit, crisp white shirt, tie slightly loosened in a way that made him look more approachable, more real. There was no hardness in his expression, no cold CEO mask, just quiet sincerity. "Good morning," she replied softly, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded gently and stepped toward his office, pausing at the door. "Could you come in for a moment?" he asked. Her heart jumped, but she followed him, closing the door gently behind her. The office felt different today, not because of the furniture or the sunlight spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but because of the shift in the air. The unspoken understanding that something essential had changed between them, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, folding her hands in her lap while he leaned against the edge of his desk, a posture she had never seen him adopt. Casual, unshielded, almost vulnerable. "I've been thinking about a lot," he began, his voice quiet but firm, as if he had rehearsed the words but still wasn't sure how they would land. "This weekend opened my eyes in ways I wasn't prepared for." Elena listened, her pulse quickening. "For 7 years," he continued, "I saw you only through the lens of work, through what you did for me, how you kept this company running. I relied on you more than I rely on anyone else, but I never allowed myself to understand who you actually were behind all that." She swallowed softly. People don't usually look that far. "They should," he said, his tone sharpening with conviction. "I should have." Silence stretched between them, not heavy but meaningful. "I don't want to repeat that mistake," he said. "Not with you, not with anyone. The retreat made me realize how much of my life I've lived with blinders on, and I don't want to go back to that version of myself." Her breath caught, but she kept her eyes steady on his. "There's something I'd like to propose," he said, shifting slightly as if pushing through an internal barrier. "I want to adjust your role." Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "I want you to step into a higher position," he explained. "Not because of the retreat, not because of whatever this shift is, but because you have been operating far above your title for years. You deserve recognition, Alina, real recognition, not invisibility disguised as responsibility." She blinked, stunned. "You're offering me a promotion." "I'm offering you a place where your voice matters," he corrected. "Where you're not in the shadows, where the company sees you the way I should have all along." A wave of emotion moved through her. Relief, gratitude, disbelief. "What role?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. "Executive Operations Manager," he said. "A leadership position, more autonomy, more decision-making, a salary that reflects the work you've always done, and freedom to create boundaries I've never allowed you to have." Her heart throbbed with astonishment. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," he replied. "Because I don't want an answer today. I want you to choose the version of your life that feels right to you, not the version you feel obligated to accept." She nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." A faint, almost relieved smile crossed his lips. They were quiet for a moment before he spoke again, gentler. "I also want you to know something else." She looked up. "What happened at the retreat, the conversations we had, the moments we shared, that wasn't just a temporary shift for me," he said. "I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. I don't want to pretend I didn't see you differently." Her heart began to race. "But I also don't want you to worry," he continued softly. "Nothing will be inappropriate. Nothing will cross lines. I'm not asking for anything beyond honesty." Her shoulders relaxed, relief washing through her. "What I want," he said with a quiet intensity, "is to build a workplace where you don't feel the need to disappear." Her eyes warmed with emotion. "That's all I've ever wanted." They shared a moment, soft, subtle, powerful, where the air felt charged with the possibility of a new beginning. Not romantic, not rushed, not messy, just human, respectful, transformative. He exhaled deeply. "So, where do we go from here?" Alina thought for a moment, her voice steady when she finally answered. "Forward," she said, "just forward." He nodded, as if that single word carried everything the two of them had quietly decided. "Then forward it is," he said. Slowly, carefully, she stood to leave, but before she reached the door, he spoke one last time. "Alina," he said softly. She turned, her hand still on the handle. "I see you," he said, not dramatically, not romantically, but as a truth long overdue. Her eyes softened, "And I see you too." She left his office with a heart lighter than she had in years. That day marked the beginning of a new era, not a love story, not a fairy tale, but a journey of self-worth, healing, and mutual respect. The walls that once defined their roles didn't crumble overnight, but they cracked just enough for something real to emerge. Alina stepped into her new life not as an assistant hiding in plain sight, but as a woman finally seen, not because of a dress or a resort or a moment, but because she chose to stop dimming herself. Jackson stepped into his own transformation, shedding a lifetime of emotional distance to become a leader defined not by ruthlessness, but by growth. And together, without crossing any lines, they shaped a workplace and a future built on recognition, presence, and the courage to change.